This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. So I now want to take up another aspect of technological dynamism, which is rather more complicated than what I dealt with before, but which bears a great deal of thinking, and I hope that my audience will go out and do some independent thinking about it. Now, at a certain point in the Grundrisse, Marx makes the interesting kind of comment. He says, at some point, technology is going to become a business. And I've always thought that was a very prescient kind of comment. And I thought, well, Marx suggests that technology could become a business, and we might want to think about explore the implications of that. But I've never really done it, so I'm now going to do it, as it were, to ask, well, yeah, if it's a business, what kind of business is it? And who is engaged in the business, and what do they do, and what's the use value of this business, and what's the exchange value, and all those kinds of simple kinds of questions that Marx asks. Well, let me start off by saying this, that in 1970, the biggest employers of labor and most important corporations in the United States were General Motors, Ford, US Steel, industries like that. By the time you get to 1990, the biggest employers of labor, and actually in terms of capital value, are organizations like Kentucky Fried Chicken. Not Kentucky Fried Chicken, but the holding company for Kentucky Fried Chicken and the holding company for McDonald's. In other words, the United States has shifted from producing cars to producing hamburgers and Kentucky Fried Chicken. If you ask that question today, what are the most important companies? Well, about 2 weeks ago, the capitalized value of Apple was over $3 trillion. It was the largest corporation in the world in terms of valuation. And we had a sector called FANGs, which is generally referred to on the stock exchange as the tech sector. FANGs is Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and you may put an S on it, and I don't know exactly what it would be. All of those companies really hardly existed in 1990. Amazon was founded in 1974, didn't make a profit till 2001, and now is huge. Apple was a fading company in the early 90s, and it had good ideas, but had no way to operationalize them, but managed through Tim Cook towards the end of the 1990s into the 2000s to latch on to production processes in China. So Apple is a very interesting organization. Okay, it's a tech firm and it produces new technologies, very much. But how does it produce new technologies? Well, in effect, it's a merchant capitalist firm because, yeah, it does the design and it does all the prototype designs and so on, but the actual production goes on in China and elsewhere through a supply chain. And let me read to you a little bit something about what goes on in this supply chain. And it's easy to get, and it is an account of what's going on in Chinese factories. And yes, okay, it's funded by Western interests, and therefore it is, but it's about labor rights and all the rest of it. And this is what they said about one of the firms, which is in the supply chain of Apple, is called Catcher Technology, and it makes the metal casings. These metal casings for computers and other things. And one of the things that China Watch does is it suggests to somebody that they go and take a job inside of one of these firms and work in the firm. And somebody went and worked in Catcher Technology for 2 or 3 years and wrote a report about the experience. And this is what they said. While at the factory, the investigator worked on parts of the latest iPad. Capture Technology also produces iPhone 6 parts in its factories in Suqian and Taizhou. Now, this report is from 2013. It's old, but you can get a more modern one if you go on the website. The investigator discovered extensive violations of Chinese labor laws. Chinese labor laws, not our labor laws. Chinese labor laws, as well as violations of Catcher's policies and Apple's supplier code of conduct. Apple had been criticized about what was going on in its supply chain and developed a code of conduct, which of course it doesn't really enforce. This code of Apple's supplier code of conduct details standards for worker rights and environmental sustainability for any company supplying to Apple. Many of the violations were similar to those found in a 2013 investigation of the same plant, the results of which were shared with Apple by China Labor Watch. Since 2005, Apple Inc. has promoted a supplier code of conduct that lists extensive labor, human rights, and environmental standards to which Apple's third-party suppliers should conform. Apple implements internal first-party and third-party verification systems to monitor compliance to its code. Inspection results were often accompanied by timetables for reform or corrective action plans, which often include steps such as reducing working hours, carrying out full payment of insurance, and strengthening hiring systems to prevent underage labor. In recent years, more of the information has been released to the public. Apple's supplier responsibility standards, inspector reports, corrective action plans, and annual reports look good on paper. Without sufficient transparency regarding actual factory labor conditions, many in the public, including investors, policymakers, and consumers, may assume that Apple invests the resources necessary to carry out the corrective action plans and ensure its supply chain factories follow the supplier code of conduct. After all, these are basic legal and human rights standards, and Apple, as the most profitable electronics company in history and the third most profitable company in the world, has the resources to uphold them. Unfortunately, after the inspections are complete and the corrective action plans are handed down to factories from Apple, there are often no fundamental improvements in labor conditions and treatment of workers making Apple products. This report documents the lack of progress in factory manufacturing components for Apple products, despite clear evidence of persistent violations of Chinese law and codes of conduct of both Apple and its suppliers. While Apple recently announced that it is banning benzene and N-hexene in its 16 final assembly factories in China, which is an important step forward for the company, the violations documented in this report demonstrate that Apple has a long way to go to ensure workers are laboring under safe and fair conditions. Now, Apple is an interesting company. Like I say, it's really a sort of a merchant capitalist company, but also a design and control operation at the front. Most of the value in an Apple computer is actually created back down the supply chain in the making of the casement and the making of the chips and the making of all of these other things. So a huge amount of value is actually constructed back through that supply chain. But you find the actual profit levels of those firms in the supply chain are very low relative to Apple. There was an item in the Financial Times a few years back which said, well, compare, for example, Foxconn, which is the big assembly plant. Foxconn works on a profit rate of around 3%. In a sense, 3% is pretty good because Foxconn is a very, very large enterprise, so it's 3% on a very, very large amount. So there's a lot of profit coming out of that. But Apple's profit rate was 28%. So what this says is that the place where value is created is not necessarily the place where it is appropriated. And Apple appropriates most of it. So this is the kind of business it is. It's into appropriation of a huge amount of value, which is done by laborers living under the work conditions which I've described, way back down the value chain, So this is the kind of business it is. And when you go around and start looking at all of the other businesses like Apple, you'll find it's rather similar. Netflix, for example, the labor conditions are now being coming out in California on Netflix are absolutely appalling, and the safety and that is highlighted by the fact that somebody actually fired a loaded gun and killed a director by mistake on the set, and this is kind of so the standards there are absolutely awful, and those standards were being enforced at a period when Netflix was hugely increasing its product, which is mainly entertainment and platforming, hugely increasing its product. And its output at a time when the virus was actually really problematic. So Netflix is another example where it turns out the labor conditions are absolutely appalling. In this case, it's in California. In the case we're looking at here, we're looking at China Labor Watch and the labor conditions there. So when we say that the labor conditions are what they are, then what we're really doing is condemning in effect the whole tech sector as being super exploitative of its labor forces, and totally disregarding any requirements of unionization. And there's some fights going on in Amazon right now over unionization and labor and the like. So what we're beginning to see then is the emergence of this sector, which is the largest and most powerful sector of contemporary capitalist economy, and that sector is really in a terrible mess. So the high-tech sector, which has become a business and has become big business in our times. In fact, the leading businesses of capital are in this sector. So when Marx kind of said it's going to become a business, he was being very prescient, but we didn't appreciate exactly what this might mean. And the same issues, by the way, as happened with Apple, happen in China. And the two big ones there are Alibaba and Tencent. And Alibaba is run by somebody called Jack Ma. And there came a point of considerable unrest, and this goes back to the software, considerable unrest in the labor force of Alibaba, because it was actually employed on what's called a 996 rhythm. And the 996 meant you go to work at 9 in the morning, you come home 9 at night, and you do that for 6 days a week. And a lot of young people and entrepreneurs and so on caught up in Alibaba, which is a sophisticated, educated kind of workforce for the most part, were getting very annoyed and irritated at that, and they were protesting against the 996 system. And Jack Ma's response was to say that they should be pleased that they have a job. And secondly, they should be delighted that by working so hard, they were actually contributing to the fact that the Chinese economy was getting close to outpacing the US economy in terms of both size and growth. In fact, in purchasing power parity, the Chinese have the largest economy in the world right now. So that's what Jack Ma said, and there was considerable unrest as a result. He said some other things about the Communist Party, which didn't go down well, and so Jack Ma disappeared, and it appears he's being a bit re-educated. The 996 system has been abolished by the Chinese government, and they've said basically there has to be another way in which things can be organized. Chinese youth has taken to a silent form of opposition, which is laying down. We don't know how much of this is going on, but apparently what is happening is you've got a lot of fairly well-educated people coming out of universities who are finding it difficult finding a satisfying job. And to that degree, they are protesting, and rather than protesting by marching and billboards and this kind of thing, they're simply lying down. And it's interesting. This goes back to the sort of autonomista view that one of the ways in which Labour can revolt is not to participate. So the lying down phenomena has become a bit important in China too. So, but this is what the high-tech sector is about. And the competition within the high-tech sector is to some degree between firms, but it's also within firms. And what the Chinese did in Beijing some years back was to set up a whole area of the city, which was going to be zero rent for people to move into. And it was called the Avenue of the Entrepreneurs. And anybody who had an idea, anybody who thought they could do something in developing apps or electronics or whatever, could move in there and could work there and hope to make their fortune. And all accounts are that the coercive laws of competition are incredibly fierce, incredibly enforced by the municipality and by the companies which are behind all of this. And the result is a tremendous ferment of new ideas coming out and a tremendous technological push, which has many people saying right now, in terms of artificial intelligence, China is ahead of the United States. And it's ahead partly because of this mobilization of the internal laws of coercive laws of competition. It's partly for that reason, but partly also because in China you have a population where there is a vast data set, and artificial intelligence needs a vast data set to work upon. And so that the Chinese have, both in terms of the production side, but also in terms of the data side, a tremendous advantage over the United States, where there are all sorts of barriers to getting information about people. So this is one of the things that seems to me is going on, and therefore we have to then kind of say, well, what kind of technology is coming out of this, and what is this technology being used for? Well, there are benevolent uses of it, and then there are some non-benevolent uses of it, and I'll be a bit personal about this. I actually like my Alexa music system. It means I have access to all of the jazz I want and all of the classical music I want, all of the songs I want. I mean, it's fantastic. And I kind of think to myself, this has made my life, particularly under the conditions of the pandemic, much better. I can sit there, listen to this music, or I can work listening to this music and so on. So the Alexa system is absolutely phenomenal in lots of ways, and I'm kind of very grateful for it. Of course, it's monetized. I'm charged for it. But now what we're seeing is the monetization of everything and the creation of platforms and so on, complicated platforms where you want to watch something, but in order to get onto this platform, you have to kind of sign up, and they sign you up free, which is free for 2 weeks or something of that kind. And then, of course, the payment which you've authorized in order to get the free 2 weeks, it then becomes a permanent payment and so on. So suddenly you find yourself being sucked into a whole kind of monetized world where it's very difficult to get out of. It's incredibly easy to sign on to one of these platforms. It's incredibly difficult to get off it. And so what we start to see is that actually a lot of the platforms right now and a lot of the work that's going on the web is about finding ways to steal money. That's what it really amounts to legally steal money in some instances. In other instances, it's a darn sight shadier. So you then kind of say, now, what good is this? In what ways is this good? And to what good is that? And I use this category in my own work of what I call accumulation by dispossession. That is, capitalists who accumulate not by making anything or doing anything, but by stealing, in effect. Now, this, of course, is something that happened in the world of primitive accumulation way back in the origins of capitalism. But nowadays, it's happening, and it's not primitive accumulation anymore. It's using technologies to try to suck out as much value as possible. And of course, we see identity theft, we see hackers and all sorts of things of this kind going on. So when we say that technology becomes a business, it becomes a business with all sorts of negative characteristics in terms of the internal organization of the labor process and labor relations and social relations and all the rest of it. But it is also becoming a process which has some very positive impacts and also some very negative impacts. Take, for example, Facebook. We know all the stories about Facebook and how good it is and what it does for people, but at the same time we know that it's done some horrendous things, and it plays a very important role in certain aspects of politics and so on, and it has very negative features, and monetization of access to a lot of this is becoming, for me, somewhat oppressive. So there are all of those elements, and then there's another aspect. When Marx talked about technology becoming a business, he started to think about and recognize. He started to recognize that there's a difference between a new technology which is coming online within a particular firm for a particular reason, and the creation of generic technologies. Now, the generic technology, above all in Marx's time, was of course the steam engine. Steam engines could be used to power looms, they could be used to drain mines, they could be used to, make locomotives, and they could be used to power steamboats and all the rest of it. So in other words, the steam engine was a form of technology that had multiple uses in all sorts of areas. Therefore, it was not confined to a particular industry. This was not true of the power looms. You made the power looms, or you made the cotton gin or something like that, and that was a very specific technological innovation built within a particular industry, and therefore it was very specific. And it didn't have that much transferability. It's not as if the hand loom could be taken and put down a mine shaft or help to drive a steam engine train. So, but the generic technologies become very significant. And what this means is that there is a tremendous profitability to be had if you can create a generic technologies with multiple uses across as many things as possible. Now, obviously, in our time, the computer and computer capacity is a generic technology. And therefore, the computerization of everything starts to become a very part of what the technological dynamism is about. And these generic technologies seem to me to have taken over very much the whole kind of dynamics of what technological organization and what technological change is all about. Now, again, all of these features, by the way, and this again is rather significant, all of these features involve what I would call hardware. That there is it doesn't appear that way, of course, but there is the hardware. The technology is in the computer. There's the technology in the computer. There's the hardware. And the hardware is a commodity that has to be bought. So the trading of the hardware becomes a vital feature. It's harder to trade software. It's harder to trade organizational forms. You can have specialists and consultants who will come on and consult about your organizational form and so on, but that's not the same as buying a machine which will do something. And the generic technology, the purpose of the generic technology is, of course, to try to create something which is a substitute for human labor. So we got this thing which has always been there about technology, that one of the things you're doing when you're increasing labor productivity is you're actually decreasing labor demand. And if you decrease labor demand, and if labor is the source of value, then you're going to decrease value. So the amount of value going to be created by these by way of these new technologies tends to be negative, unless you can have such a huge expansion that it actually can accommodate the new social productivity of labor and the new output through the power loom weavers. I use Marx's example of the power loom because it is, I think, helpful. When the power looms came in, there was such a huge increase in the social productivity of labor. A huge amount of cloth was made by fewer and fewer workers. But because it was so cheap, that cloth could be actually sold all around the world. So Manchester cottons were started to be sold in India, and the British imperialist regime destroyed the handloom weaving industry in India and substituted Manchester cottons. Well, it was a huge market in India. Same thing happened in China. The same thing happened elsewhere. The handloom stuff was, by and large, very expensive and very local. The power loom located everything in Manchester, all of the production in Manchester and the Manchester region, and sold worldwide. Of course, it didn't last too long because after a bit, Hong Kong and all these other places started to produce cotton cloth and textiles and all the rest of it. So textiles became an example of that sort, where the expansion of the market became so huge that it actually increased the labor force employed in power loom weaving relative to handloom weaving. But that was because of the dynamics. Now, what is going to happen in terms of artificial intelligence and replacing labor? We've seen in manufacturing the kind of generic technologies which were pulled online through automation and all the rest of it reduced the labor force in steel. It reduced the labor force in automobiles dramatically, even though the number of automobiles being produced, the amount of steel being produced did not decrease at all. So what we saw was deindustrialization, with terrible, terrible impacts upon many of those communities which had once upon a time been employed in factories at this level of at a decent wage. The deindustrialization that occurred in the United States and Europe and even into Mumbai, by the way, in India, the deindustrialization came about through technological change, and it created all sorts of social problems. We've now got coming on board artificial intelligence, which is going to do exactly the same thing to services. My services as a lecturer will not probably be needed. They may be regarded as redundant already. Pretty soon we'll find ourselves doing automated, and to some degree what happened with the Zoom response, some of the things that happened there are going to be made permanent in education and elsewhere. So that what we're going to see is an increasing application of artificial intelligence in many areas which are currently services. Healthcare, for example, is a huge area, huge employer of labor. Much of that is going to be dealt with through artificial intelligence. You don't need an anesthetist anymore. It can be done through artificial intelligence. You may soon be finding even operations being done more accurately and with less mistakes than through artificial intelligence. So this question of technology then is a long-lasting one within the history of capitalism. Yes, it starts very much with the Industrial Revolution. Yes, it starts with inter-capitalist competition. Interstate competition becomes terribly important. Then the way in which it becomes a business in itself with a particular objective. And its objectives are mixed. Its objectives are to make a profit by any means possible. And that means by stealing, if necessary, by setting up scams, by setting up platforms which you have to subscribe to if you just want to have access to what's going on in the world. These are the sorts of issues which it seems to me need to be discussed and debated and thought through. And it's going to take, I think, some thinking about not only the output of this technological dynamism and what it might be used for, but the reasons why this technological dynamism has become so significant in our society. And interstate competition and inter-capitalist competition and competition over intellectual property rights and all those sorts of things which are attached to superior technologies, those are the kinds of things which need to be looked at very carefully in relationship to this technological dynamism, which lies at the heart of, very much at the heart of where we're at right now, with all sorts of potential impacts, as we might well see in terms of the warlike configuration that we're seeing in Eastern Europe right now. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.